Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first episode ever of the Diablo 3 build factory. My name is Phobos, and in this series we will discuss certain Diablo 3 builds as well as updates on them when the patches come out. Gameplay footage in the background is from Hell mode on Act 3 and 4 as well as Act 1 and 2 on Inferno mode. So, the first episode will be about the survivability of the Demon Hunter. And while a lot of players already entered higher difficulties, such as Nightmare, Hell and of course Inferno, they also seem to struggle more and more in these higher gameplay modes. And that is most likely due to the rare champion packs with their random affixes. And of course you can rank up your armor, resistance and your health, but there's only so much you can do without losing a serious amount of damage. And most likely champion packs in Hell and Inferno will still one or two shot you. There's nothing you can do about that really. So the best bet is to not get hit at all, but the question here is, how does one do that? Before we dedicate ourselves to this topic, let's talk damage first, because the best defense doesn't help if you can't get rid of your enemies, right? So let's get to it. First off, my experiences are based on 70 hours of gameplay with the Demon Hunter and not theory crafting. I don't do much theory crafting, of course I look at it, I look at the statistics and the numbers, but most of the time I do stuff that feels right for me and my gameplay style. That doesn't mean that you don't have to or that you shouldn't do theory crafting. I just say this build is a build that feels right for me, and if it feels right for you, that's fine. If it doesn't, it's also fine. Just go ahead and try your own stuff, and if you already have a build that you absolutely love, feel free to use that. I'm not saying this is the ultimate build that every Demon Hunter has to play, but what I do say is that in Hell and Inferno difficulty mode, this build will make your life much easier, and you can take my word for that. So let's talk about primary and secondary damage first. That is your two mouse buttons. I decided to go with boulder shots and elemental arrows. Boulder shots are available as soon as level 11 and elemental arrows are available as soon as level 20. And the corresponding runes for these abilities are Imminent Doom, which is available at level 57, and Nether Tentacles at level 59. You see, that is really late in the game, so if you have other preferences, feel free to use them. I used the Screaming Skull rune for elemental arrows for a long time. You will receive that rune on level 36, so you have a little room to play around here. As for the boulder shots, I also used Hungering Arrows for a long time, as you can see in the gameplay footage, but I realized later on in the game that the boulder shots do more damage, which leads me to advantages and disadvantages of these skills. So, boulder shots. What are the advantages of boulder shots with the Imminent Doom rune, you might ask? Well, first off, you have a really high damage output on single targets. That is really undeniable. You do 182 weapon damage as arcane and 154 weapon damage as arcane to all other targets within 7 yards. Which leads me to the second advantage of the skill, AoE, Area of Effect. You do damage to a single target, but also you do damage to every enemy within 7 yards, like I said. Plus, boulder shots move really fast across the screen. And you might ask now, okay, why is this a significant advantage? But as soon as we talk about the Nether Tentacles, you will realize that this is a really important advantage, and it is really important for the synergy effects on your damage. The obvious disadvantage is you have delayed damage. You have an increased explosion delay of 2 seconds. 2 seconds doesn't seem that much, but if you're fighting a lot of enemies and the enemies are almost dead, and you're almost dead as well, that can be a really bummer if you get killed because the enemy has like 10,000 life left and the boulder shot didn't explode in time. Happens to me, happens to everyone. Plus, on a side note, boulder shots have some runes that are not really viable at all, at least in my opinion. They should be avoided at all. An example of that would be Acid Strike, completely worthless in my opinion. If you're not happy with Imminent Doom, try Thunderball, you have a nice stun there. Now let's talk about the elemental arrows with the Nifa Tentacle rune. Like the baller shots, you have a high damage output with the Nifa Tentacles. It only says like 155% weapon damage, but you have to take into account that these Nifa Tentacles move extremely slow and they do more than one tick of damage. It's not like you shoot one arrow, it flies through the enemy and only does one tick of damage. Nifa Tentacles are really big, really slow, they hit multiple times. Which leads me to the second advantage of the skill, that is, elemental arrows with Nifa Tentacles really have an area of effect potential. And that is something that I really didn't expect when I first decided to use that rune. Because I find myself in Inferno mode spamming the skill into hordes of monsters and they really take a significant amount of damage. I really didn't expect that, and you should really try that for yourself. Another obvious advantage of the skill is the life leech ability. You will receive 3% of the damage dealt as life back to you. And what does that exactly mean? Well, if you got hit by an enemy and managed to survive in the harder difficulties, you can try to get to safety and start spamming the skill into hordes of monsters. And if your healing pot is on cooldown, this option is incredibly good, because as soon as you spam the skill into monsters, your HP bar will refill really fast. So another good advantage. And the last advantage is the hatred efficiency. One shot only costs 10 hatred. In comparison to other skills, that's really not that much, especially if you consider the high amount of damage Nifa Tentacles do. So you can really rely on that skill in the long run. The disadvantages are also really obvious. For one, Nifa Tentacles only move in a straight line, which basically means enemies need to clump together to do a high amount of damage. On the other hand, Nifa Tentacles move insanely slow. That's really incredible. At times I think my character moves even faster than these big piles of blood and dark energy or whatever they really are. So a good example for this is Act 2, let's say Inferno. You can see that in the footage here, and you are fighting sand wasps. These freaking things move so fast, you can't hit them with Nifa Tentacles. It's just feasible not possible. And even if you do, by the time you killed them, something else in the desert killed you already. That's most likely for certain. Or you have to move as well. You just can't really efficiently kill sand wasp or, let's say, fast enemies in general with Nifa Tentacles. Now let's talk about the action bar skills. First off, you want one skill that is destined to be your area of effect skill. And why is that, you might ask yourself now? We already have as a secondary and a primary ability which have AoE potential. Well, yes, they have AoE potential, but they can't deal with huge amounts of enemies. They can to a certain degree, but they won't help you if like 30, 40 or 50 monsters are swarming at you. You really want a skill which can deal with these high amounts of enemies. So while I played, I realized that there are 3 options, or at least 3 viable options. And if you happen to know another option or another method that works for you, that's fine, use it. But my weapons of choice are either chakrams, I hope I pronounced that correctly, the multi-shot ability or the spike traps. So let's talk about them one after another. Chakrams are available as soon as level 12, and the recommended rune would be Twin Chakrams, which is available at level 18. And the advantages for the chakrams are that they are really early available into the game. You heard it, level 12, level 18, that's pretty early, you can use them in normal difficulty already. Plus, they clean up big chunks of enemies relatively fast. Unless you enter higher difficulty modes, such as Hell and Inferno. And this is where the disadvantage of the skill becomes clear. because I find myself not using this skill in Hell or Inferno difficulty anymore, because they only do 100% of weapon damage at a time, and in comparison that's not really that much. So I find myself using my hatred on other spells. Another option to do massive AoE damage would be multi-shot. You unlock this ability as soon as level 22, and my recommended rune would be Fire at Will, which would be unlocked at level 26, which basically means you can use that skill as soon as normal difficulty already. And while the skill is really iconic to the Diablo series, everyone remembers Amazons running around multi-shotting everything, I think this isn't the best skill to do AoE damage at all. But let's talk disadvantages and advantages first. Advantages: multi-shot almost does instant damage. These arrows or bolts fly extremely fast across the screen. You can do a really high amount of damage really fast. Which leads me to the second advantage, that is, multi-shot has a fine damage output. There's nothing wrong about that. Plus, multi-shot has a great effect radius. The most nagging disadvantage about multi-shot is that multi-shot isn't really hatred efficient. It is really hatred heavy. That's why I recommend using Fire at Will, because Fire at Will decrease the amount of hatred used for each multi-shot by 20, leaving it at a cost of 20 itself. But still, multi-shot is really hatred heavy. It will draw from your hatred pretty fast. That's why I don't recommend it in the long run. And the last and probably most underrated option to do a massive amount of AoE damage in a short while is the Spike Trap. Spike Traps are available as soon as level 17, and the recommended rune, which is Scatter, is unlocked at level 55. The footage in the background is the fight against Belial on Inferno difficulty, and in my opinion this is where you will realize that you need a high amount of AoE damage really fast, because you need to deal with his ads, and they are really tough. I just found out about the potential of the skill, but what I can say is you have a really high damage output and a fine effect radius. The disadvantages are: you don't have an instant damage, that's obvious, traps need to be triggered, and these traps sometimes place themselves randomly across the floor. That is, if you are close to a ledge, they will stack up really weirdly. And that's sometimes really pain in the ass if you want to inflict a high amount of damage to your enemies, but your traps wouldn't place themselves correctly. Well, that's enough for the damage. Let's talk about the main topic: survivability. How does the Demon Hunter survive in higher difficulty modes? When you first enter Nightmare mode, you will soon realize that your current build might not suffice, and that's most likely due to the fact that too many people focus on DPS-centric builds. And that's not the correct direction to go. You should more focus on your defensive abilities and on your abilities to avoid getting damage. Now let's talk about these abilities which make you avoid getting damage from your enemies. First off, let's talk about Vault, and while most of you are familiar with the skill since it is unlockable at level 9, most of you might use it in a manner to get away from your enemies. And while this is okay in normal difficulty mode, you can't really do that on Nightmare, and especially on Hell and Inferno mode. That's completely not discipline efficient. And what I mean by this is this. Look at the footage here. I'm trying to run away from a champion pack on Inferno here, and as you can see, it's not really effective at all, because the champion pack has the teleporter affix, and that's really something. If champion packs have affixes like teleporter or water or vortex, you just can't outrun them. It's simply not possible. And despite me misclicking like an idiot right here, Vault doesn't work that way anymore on higher difficulties. So you really want to use Vault in a discipline efficient way, because you can't forget, Vault costs discipline and you want to spend your discipline as efficient as possible. So, which rune should you use for Vault? My recommendation would be Acrobatics, unlocked at 38. Why Acrobatics, you might ask? Simple. First, due to the cooldown of Vault, it forces you to use it only in a matter where you can't get out of a situation. That is, when you're surrounded by enemies, don't use vault to get away from your enemies. It just won't work. You can't outrun your enemies. It won't work. Stop doing it. It drives me really insane to see it in games where people would just circle jump around enemies and they would get themselves killed by mortar or arcane sentries. It just won't work. Or at least you can't outrun them in a matter where you can fight them. If you want to skip enemies, that's fine, use vaults. But if you want to fight enemies and fight champion packs, and sooner or later you will want to do that, because how do you stack your Nephilim Valor without killing champion packs? There's no way. So you have to fight a champion pack sooner or later. So use vault only as a last resort when you're surrounded by enemies and would get yourself killed if you wouldn't jump away or out of that situation. The second reason why I recommend using acrobatics as the rune of choice is that vault doesn't cost any discipline anymore, and considering how discipline heavy this build actually is, it's really an advantage that you should use. Now let's talk about the next and probably most important skill in this build, namely Smokescreen. Smokescreen is unlocked as soon as level 8, and the recommended rune for Smokescreen would be Special Recipe, which reduces the cost of discipline to 12, which is unlocked on level 44. Now what does Smokescreen exactly do? The tooltip says vanish behind a wall of smoke, becoming momentarily invisible for 2 seconds. Now what does that exactly mean? Momentarily invisible, that means you lose any aggro from your monsters, which means, talking about vault, when you try to get away from your enemies, use Smokescreen, push the button and run away from your enemies. Momentarily your movement speed will be increased, so that shouldn't be a problem. Run around corners, that makes it even easier. Now secondly, and most important, and little does the tooltip tell you this, is the fact that Smokescreen makes you momentarily invulnerable. In fact, for the 2 seconds that you are invisible. So if you time the attacks of your enemies accordingly, you won't receive any damage at all. And this also applies to boss abilities. You can see right here I'm fighting Aswell with a group, and I get cornered by this weird floor thingy he does, and actually there would be no way for me out of this. But due to the fact that I use Smokescreen, I can activate the skill, jump to safety and don't receive any damage at all. Apart from the invulnerability and the loss of any aggro, you also can break free from any movement impairing effects. So let's say you're put into a jail by random champion pack. Press Smokescreen, you break free from the jail. And let's say you're getting stunned, it's the same thing. Press Smokescreen and you're out of the stun. It's a really nice addition to the skill itself, and it really helps in the higher difficulties. So it's a skill that is really worthwhile learning how to use it, because in fact I wouldn't have any idea how I got past Inferno Act 1 without this skill, because like I said, most likely you get 1 or 2 shotted by enemies, and it's not like they attack like punch, punch, punch. They attack really fast, so you have to react accordingly. Some people call the skill overpowered, but in my opinion that's not the case, because you're not immortal. It's not like you can spam the skill, it doesn't work that way. Of course you only have so much discipline you can spend on Smokescreen. That's why I decided to use Preparation as the 4th and final skill of the action bar. And Preparation is unlocked as soon as level 13, and the corresponding rune that I would recommend would be Battle Scars, which is unlocked at level 35. And this makes the skill become something like a second health pot, because if you have your health pot on a cooldown, of course you can use Nefer Tentacles to recharge your life, but sometimes that's just not fast enough. So it's a really nice addition to the fact that you restore all of your discipline, that you can also heal yourself by 60%. But most important, you restore your discipline, and restore discipline means you have more time to use Smokescreen and to stay out of harm's way, and that's just the way it is on Inferno difficulty. Don't get hit, don't die. If you're not happy with the Battle Scars rune, that's fine, if you don't want a second healing option. But you could also try the backup plan rune, which is unlocked on level 52. It gives you a 30% possibility that you don't have a cooldown on Preparation, which means you have even more discipline on Smokescreen and can even survive longer. And that's all I got for you today. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to press the like button, it's really much appreciated. And if you want to stay up to date on the episodes of the build factory of Diablo 3, make sure to subscribe, that is also really much appreciated. And yeah, until then, take care and goodbye.